Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. This week we're going to tackle Manoir De Mes Reves by Django Reinhardt, and we're going to do a kind of chord melody interpretation of it. This one's going to include some very rich and lush chord voicings, very typical of Django's style. It's also very loose and very sparse, so we have plenty of time to think about what we're doing, and we can also be very creative and expressive with our feel and our timing on this. We're in the key of D major, and we start off by outlining a repeating 5-1 progression. So on simple terms, that would be A7 to D major. Now we can do some adjustments to these chords to make them sound extra sweet and extra authentic. So this is a really nice trick. So imagine A7 extended with a 13 on top. Now imagine we're going to put a flat 9 in there. Typically you're going to find people putting that on the top E string. That's a great chord, A13 flat 9. So we're going to take that flat 9 and move it from the top E string down to the bottom E string. And we still have our 13th chord in the middle there. So you can think of this as A13 flat 9 with the flat 9 in the bass. Or A13 flat 9 over B flat. Or A13 over B flat. A lot of things you can call it. You could also see it as an E flat 7 with a sharp 9 with the 5th in the bass, if you'd rather see it as some kind of tritone type of substitution. Personally, I like to think of it as A13 flat 9, and I'm just aware that the flat 9 is in the bass. Now that's going to resolve to a D6-9, again very typical of the gypsy style. A lot of the pre-war jazz really favours the sound of a 6-9 chord. Okay guys, if you want the lesson materials for this, go to the links in the description. I have a Patreon where for a very small monthly price you can get hold of all of my lesson materials plus a ton of bonus stuff. And we're building a great community on there too now. There's over 150 like-minded players and there's some great discussions. Everyone's very friendly, very encouraging. Now usually this voicing would be constructed this way. You'd have the root, and then the 3rd, and then the 6th, and then the 9th, and then the 5th. We're going to take it one step further, and again a very typical Django thing, to include not only the root in the bass but the 5th as well. Now that's a key factor, it's as well as the root, not instead of the root. You know, we're quite used to this kind of thing of alternating root to 5th, but this style is all about including both, which typically Django would have done with his thumb, of course. You can do it with your thumb as well, sometimes I do, kind of depends where I'm coming from. But I also think it's really useful to learn how to do that with just the tip of the 2nd finger, barring both of those low strings at the 5th fret. Again, as we've mentioned in a few of the previous videos, aim for the wood in between the 2 strings and try and turn the finger almost 45 degrees on. And it'll be much easier. Still won't happen straight away, it's going to sound pretty terrible for a while. A lot of buzzing. So yeah, that way is how I'm going to do it. So our opening two chords, 5-1 in the key of D. A pretty nice way of doing it as well. Now before we get into the exact phrasing and timing of this, I want to show you the next part of the progression, and then we can put it into some context. We're going to play the 5-1 again, with one little difference. The top note on the D6-9 should now be the note on the B string, not the note on the top string, so do not include that note on the top, because the melody here is this. And then it goes down to... So we've got that first F sharp note as part of our A13, and then the melody goes up to that A on top. And then we go back to that F sharp note, but then we go down to this E on top. Now timing wise, again, like I said, this is quite sparse. If you really wanted to play it in the most minimal way, you would simply play this. It would be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. And that's a really cool way to play it. You could do the whole thing like that, or you could just do that at the beginning of the tune before building up a bit of momentum and filling in some of those gaps. The way I played it in the opening performance, you know, it changes every time for me, but I just felt the need to fill those gaps a little more. So I did some very kind of gentle, brushed, gypsy style strumming on all those quarter notes in between. That kind of thing. If you're going to do that, make sure to accent the melody part still. And then go a little quieter. Probably exaggerating there, but you get the point. Contrast the two. You know, the infill should be quieter than the melody. You can throw in a nice little lead fill on that second 5-1. This isn't exactly what Django played or anything. Remember, this is our interpretation of it. But this is very much a Django-ism. All on the B string, I'm playing a trill, hammering on from 3 to 5 and back, and then play the 2nd fret, 3rd fret, up to the 7th fret, the major third of that D chord. And adding some very typical Django style fast vibrato. So with that addition, we now have this, if we go from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to do this. Again, a very typical Django-ism. Simply take the 1 chord, drop it a whole tone, and walk chromatically back to the 1, making sure to always include that thick interval in the bass, you know, the 5th and the root together each time. I know I mentioned it already, but it really is an important element if you're trying to get an authentic pre-war jazz chord sound. Makes things sound much fatter. Now for this next part of the progression, we're not going to play the 5-1 again, but we're going to play the 5, the A13 flat 9, and then go to an A minor 7, before going to a D7. So that would be a 2-5 in the key of G, which is where we're about to end up. So we're 2-5ing the 4 chord of our original key of D. So to break that down into specifics, we've got the A13 flat 9 to an A minor 7, and then we're going to play one of these line cliches. But we're going to extend the line to come up from underneath the major third of the D chord. And then land in that D7, before moving the opening progression, that 5-1 in the key of D, all the way up to the 4 chord, so the 5-1 in the key of G now. So that would be a D13 with the flat 9 in the bass, to a G6-9, again with both the 5th and the root in the bass. And then we come back down, back home to the 5-1. And then we're going to play a melody. And move into this E9 chord. So a 2 dominant, or the 5 of 5 you could call it. And then I'm going to play this thing that again is very much a typical Django-ism. You hear him use this on Melody au Crépuscule, which is one of my favourite pieces of his. That's the full line, in fact. We don't use that final voicing in this case. So we're playing kind of an abridged version of that phrase. But let me show you the full line because it's pretty and it's good to understand it. So we're on this E9 chord, which as we know is just an E7 with the 9 added. Now if you take the top 4 strings of that, put them on the first 2 fingers, and then add the 13 on top at the 9th fret of the top E. So this would be like an E13, and then change that top note down to a flattened 5th. So that would be an E9 flat 5. Then back to a plain old E9 before inverting that same chord and coming down to this really nice E9 voicing, which to me always just seemed like an E7 where we've taken the top 4 strings and added the 9. So the way we're going to fit it in with this is we have to cut that last chord off to fit the next part of the melody in. To the E flat 9, which would be the tritone sub of your A7, before going to an actual A7 for one hit where we stop. And then we're back to the 5-1 again. Where again we throw in one of these little where this time we do a little variation on the line cliche. This is a little rundown using the 9 of the A minor on the D string, coincidentally also at the 9th fret, with the 5th fret of the G string on top, then come down a whole tone to the root and walk down in semitones till you get back to your major 3rd of the D7 on that D string, and then bury it within that chord. And then we're back up here to this D13 flat 9, G6 9, where the top note is the D note. There's your melody. Then we move that top note up to E and try and keep the remnants of that shape intact. And then we go to another beautiful voicing for E9. So we've had a few so far. We had the basic E9 and then the top 4 strings, some of these funky little alterations, that voicing. Now we're up here with this one. Open E string and then onto the D string, 12, 13, 12, 14. So you've got your flat 7, the 3rd, the 5th and the 9. And then the melody comes down to the D note on the top string, and you can keep as much of that E9 as possible. I would always recommend trying to do that so things sound a little smoother. You don't want to break up the sound too much. So I'm keeping the 3rd and 2nd fingers where they are while I reach back to change that melody note. And then we move that same shape down a semitone for the E flat 9. You could visualize the root here on the low E string, 11th fret. Or you could just think of it as a chord where you're building it off the flat 7 of the E flat. And then we go to the A7. Remember we said this E flat would be the tritone sub of the A7 anyway, where we play one of my favourite dominant chord voicings, an A13 with a flat 9. So it's the same thing as this, just an inversion of it, where you now have the open A string being the root, the major 3rd, flat 7, flat 9 and 13. And then we're going to walk down chromatically on the top string and try and keep the rest of this shape intact somehow, even if it means reshuffling the fingers. You've got a few options. And then resolve to a D6-9. Unlike this one's rooted on the low E string, and we don't bother putting the 5th or anything else in the bass with it. We're just playing the low E string 10th fret, killing the A string, and then barring the top 4 where you've got the 9-9 and the 10-10. This is an interesting little side note, by the way. The 6-9, the top 4 strings can stay intact, whether you're rooting it on the low E or on the A. So this top portion of the shape can just be transported up the fretboard. So D6-9 rooted on the A string, D6-9 rooted on the E string, kind of unique in that way. You'll hear that kind of thing being put to good use for endings, where you're just dragging the shape up the fretboard. Nice little trick to remember. So we've got our A13 flat 9, chromatically descending down and resolving to the D6-9 here. And then I just throw in another very common Django-ism. Django liked to play 4 minor to 1 a lot. So 4 minor would be the G minor 6. We're going to play an inversion of that on the top 4 strings. So this would be frets 5, 7, 5, 6, and then resolve to the other D6-9 off the A string. And then back to your A13 flat 9, and then either finish on D6-9 with the top note being on the B string, or let that be the start of another go round. So that's our breakdown of the actual piece, but now let's do a bit of our homework on some of these chord shapes and talk a little bit about some theory. So let's consolidate some of our chord voicings and let's deal with major chords that contain 6s and 9s. So let's take a D6 as our starting point off the A string here. Quite a common voicing for a D major 6. So we've got the root, the 3rd, the 6th, and the root again. Now, if we climb that top note up a whole tone, rather than a duplicate of the root note, we now have the 9 on top. So this would be a D6-9 as opposed to just a D6. Now the top string would be the 5th, so it's kind of optional, you take or leave it. And as we saw earlier, we can also put that 5th down in the bass if we want. So you've got a few options there: D6, D6-9 on the middle 4 strings, or extended up to the top string with the 5th on top, or down with the low E string, 5th on the bottom. Any combination of those elements is great. You also have a D6 chord over this side, which is not one to be sniffed at. I think a lot of people think of that as almost too basic or too obvious, but Django used it a lot. Just a D major, but with that top string barred also. Another nice way of playing a major 6th in this position would be this one, which you've seen me use a lot. That's kind of a bit more of a stretchy one, especially between these 2 fingers here. But I think of that as being related to this major 7th, and imagine you've taken the 7 down a whole tone to the 6th. Do check out my jazz survival guide if you've not seen it. I'll link it in the description. It goes through all of those kinds of voicings. Now, as always, you've got to prioritize knowing your chords in at least 2 basic positions: rooted on the A string and rooted on the E string. So now let's move to the E string. There's your root, there's the D. Let's do a D6, skipping the A string. So you got the root, the 6th, the 3rd, and the 5th. Nice voicing for a D6. Now, if we want to make this a 6-9, you've got a couple of options. One of the ones we already discussed, where the shape on the top 4 strings mirrors that of the shape down there that we had off the A string position. Simply the root note now it would be on the low E string. So that's one option. But another option that you've seen me use a lot as well would be this one that I know people find difficult, but it's really worth persevering with. All the good things in life take a lot of work, and this is one of those really good things. I put this up there with fine whiskey and caviar. So this would be thumb playing the root, 2nd finger again doing that barring at the tip of the finger on the 12th fret of the A and D strings, 1st finger at 11 on the G, 3rd finger barring the top 2 strings at the 12th fret. That again is a real authentic voicing for a 6-9 chord. Now if you played that same thing but left the top string out, that would just be a D6 again, another really nice voicing for it. George Harrison was a fan of that voicing. If you check out a lot of the early Beatles stuff, he uses that quite a bit. And then one final voicing that's really born out of this voicing that we started with here is if you were to take that 5th an octave down from the B string to the 12th fret of the A string. That's one of my favourite voicings again. That's the same thing we had down here with that slightly stretchy one. It's not as stretchy here, but it's still fiddly. But again, if it's hard, it's probably worth it. Now what about the A7 chord? Let's look at some nice ways of playing that A13 with a flat 9. Now we've already used this one with a flat 9 in the bass, which we've already said that we were kind of thinking of as this, where you'd have the root in the bass, the flat 7, the 3rd, the 13 and the flat 9 on top. Now again, although that's tricky, it's well worth doing. Players like Barney Kessel, Jim Hall, Johnny Smith, they would use that routinely. Now, if you've not seen my video called Misty Classy Chords, do check that out. I will link that in the description too. It contains some of these really lush voicings. Now, one really cool thing you can do with that is you can move it around in minor thirds. Because of the diminished quality of it, you know, it's actually born out of an A half-whole diminished scale. Now again, make sure you check out the links in the description. I've got a video that's a deep dive into the diminished and shows some easy ways to think about it. We can move this same kind of voicing onto the next string set. Again, very Jim Hall sounding, that one. Now let's try and find a way of playing a 13th with a flat 9 off the A string. Again, there's the one we featured in the chord melody, all the way up here. So let's imagine we're not going to use the open A string. Let's actually fret that note. So you'd have 12, 11, 12, 11, 14. So that would be root 3, flat 7, flat 9, 13. Tricky on this guitar because there's no cutaway, but still doable. It's a great chord. Now again, we can find that Jim Hall voicing right around here if we build it off the flat 7. So you've got those two options there. And again, you just want to practice resolving these things to the nearest possible place. So the D6-9 there, for example, or the D6-9 that's there. Or in the case of down here, the D6-9 that's there, Johnny Smith style. Or resolving down to this one. Another nice alternative to this one is to not have the A string in the bass, but put the actual A note in the bass on that low E string. Sounds very tense, but it resolves really nicely. Just makes that payoff even more satisfying. Now tone-wise, I'm sure you already know this if you've seen some of my other videos, but this is my 53 ES125, all original. Love the pickup in here, super high output and fat sounding. I'm running Tomastic 12 gauge flat wounds on here. These are their swing series. I've got the volume and tone all the way up, and I'm running it into a Lazy J20 amp, which is like an old Fender Tweed style circuit. But I'm also blending that signal with the vocal mic here, which adds a lot of acoustic liveliness to the sound. And I'm using this 2mm smoker pick from Honey Picks again. Now, recommended listening is going to sound pretty daft, but listen to everything Django ever recorded. You know, that sounds quite intense, but I'm a huge Django fan, as I'm sure you know. And I think there's so much value in listening to everything you can find of his. He's so much more than just fast runs and jovial, bouncy swing music. His ballad playing was profoundly beautiful. There's a few fairly obscure tracks I'm going to link to that I would recommend. One is Melody O Crepuscule. I mentioned that earlier. For me personally, that's probably my favourite Django recording, because to me it shows what a complete player he was. You've got his incredible sensitive accompaniment in there, some amazing chord work, some great little runs between the melody, and then his solo is just sublime. His touch is so light, his vibrato is so beautiful, his phrasing is so inventive. You know, check that song out for sure. Also a song called Porto Cabello. That's a great example of how inventive he was as a writer and an arranger. You know, just switching tempos like it's nothing. Keeping with the ballad theme, also September Song. There's a particular version of that where he's playing with Hubert Rostang on clarinet, soul-destroyingly beautiful. And one of his very late recordings, a song called Anuman, which is this really dark, minor key ballad with a haunting melody. Got to check that out too. There's also this obscure track that him and Stefan Grappelli played together, Tchaikovsky's Starry Night. There's something magical about Django's playing on that, as there is on most of these recordings, to be fair. Like I say, I could just keep listing song after song. I think what I'll have to do is make a playlist of my favourite Django ballads and chuck them up on the Patreon for anyone who wants to hear more recommendations. Okay guys, thanks for joining me. I'm a little disappointed that Louis didn't put in an appearance, but he's out there exploring the world somewhere. Probably getting up to no good. Probably terrorising some mice. Hopefully he'll join us next week, and I'll see you then. Take care.